Do you think the Earth's biosphere is in trouble, and why is it in trouble?
Well, I don't only think that the biosphere is in trouble. I know it is. I just have to look around in the environment in which I live. I just have to look at the Mount Kilimanjaro, for example, or Mount Kenya, and recall the fact that when I was growing up, there was a lot of ice and snow and glaciers on these mountains, that there were many rivers flowing from these mountains. In fact, I learned early that there are over 300 rivers flowing from Mount Kenya alone. And yet today, we have patches of ice and snow on these mountains, and many rivers that flow from these mountains have dried up. And many that were big rivers are now streams. And we know that the monsoon rains that used to come regularly come now irregularly and sometimes not at all. And we have observed that when droughts come, they are prolonged. Just in this year, we had a very bad drought in Kenya, affecting mostly the drier areas of the country, in the eastern part of the country. And we saw people dying, animals dying. We saw wildlife dying because of lack of vegetation, and people trekking long distances in search of water and grass for their livestock. So I know we have a problem in our biosphere. Recently, I saw the film that the former Vice President Al Gore has produced. And there we have a lot of data of what is happening in many other parts of the world. The trouble we have, or the difficulty we have with the environmental degradation, with the problems that we have, is that they happen very, very slowly. Quite often, the generation that facilitates or that is responsible for the environmental degradation is not the one that pays the price. It's a very slow process. And so we need to be very alert to understand that, so that we do not put our future generations in jeopardy as we pursue our own satisfaction today.
So, so, what do you think it is about humans that have caused us to be destructive towards the environment?
Human beings do not destroy the environment deliberately and consciously. There are very few of us who go out there and maliciously want to harm the trees, want to harm marine life, want to destroy the very essence that sustains our own life. What is wrong with us human beings is that so many of us are ignorant about how the environment gets destroyed. So many of us do not make the linkages between our activities and what we do to the environment. And just to give a few examples, in my own part of the world, I keep telling people, let us not cut trees irresponsibly. Let us not destroy, especially the forested mountains. Let's not interfere with the ecological systems in these mountains, because they are playing a very important part of our life. They are responsible for our survival. Because if you destroy the forests on these mountains, the rivers will stop flowing, and the rains will become irregular, and the crops will fail, and you will die of hunger and starvation. Now, the problem is people don't make those linkages. They don't see how cutting trees in the forest will eventually make them die of hunger and starvation. When we are driving our cars, especially in the highly developed countries, or we are consuming resources because they are available, either within our borders or we can buy them wherever they are because we have the capital to do so, we have the ability to do so, we do not quite realize that as we drive our cars in a very inefficient way, throwing tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we don't think that that gas is going to interfere with the ice in the polar regions. We don't think that some of the pollutants that come out of our factories and our domestic appliances are eventually going to get into the water and into the plants and into the animals and foods that we eat. We don't think of the food chain and how we actually depend on each other, that we eat plants, we eat animals, and when we die, we are recycled also, and we are used by them. We just recycle everything, including ourselves. We don't think about that. So I would say that one of the most important things that we need to do for ourselves is to inform ourselves. That is why I recommend very much, and I commend very much, what people like the Vice President Ango are doing with the film, The Inconvenient Truth, giving us information. That is why it is so important to listen to what our local environmental groups tell us, because what our local papers tell us, what our friends tell us, because that information will help us to change our mindset, to change our lifestyle, even in small ways. You don't have to do big things. You can do little things, like what I do, plant trees. But if there are many people planting trees, if there are many people trying to cut down on the emissions of greenhouse gases, if there are many people protecting our ecological systems, then eventually all these little actions accumulate and they make a positive impact on our environment.
That's great. And that leads us right to the next statement, which is you've said cultural revival might be the only thing that stands between conservation and destruction. Do you think cultural revival is important, and is it possible, and are you seeing it happening?
Well, I think that quite often when we talk about culture, some of us are threatened by culture because sometimes there are aspects of culture that we think interfere with our freedoms, interfere with human rights, and especially women's rights, certainly where I come from. And so the word culture itself sometimes threatens. But it's important to appreciate that culture is how we express the cumulative knowledge, experiences that we have gathered in the course of our human history. Because that's what culture is. When I think of culture, I think of the traditions, the values that we have come to appreciate, our religious, our faith, our religious beliefs, our traditions, the food we eat, how we produce that food, how we prepare that food, how we store that food, how we pass the seeds to the next generation, how we teach the next generation to take care of itself. These are all aspects of culture. Our songs, our dances, our stories, these are all aspects of our culture. And I just want to illustrate one aspect that reminds me of what happens to us when we lose that, some of that traditions and wisdom. When I was growing up, I was growing up in the countryside, and I was very close to the soil. I was very close to the environment. I worked in the field with my mother. I fetched water from the river, and I brought it to home, and we didn't even boil it, let alone put chemicals, because there were no germs. We would drink it straight. It was clean. And in a new book I have written called Unbowed, I related to the fact that as a child, I used to go to the stream very close to our homestead, and I would play with the frog eggs. And I would think that those frog eggs were beads. You know how frog eggs are connected with jelly, and they are brown and black, and they look very beautiful. They are all the same size. Well, to me, they looked like beads. And I thought that if I could only pick them ever so lightly, I could put them around my neck. Well, every time I tried, the jelly would break. Every time I tried, I didn't know what was breaking. But every time I tried, they would break. And then one day I would go there, and there would be no frog eggs. Instead, there would be thousands of tadpoles. And I would play with the tadpoles, and I would try to hold the tadpoles by their tails. And it was so difficult. If you have ever tried to hold tadpoles by their tails. Now, that's the world of my childhood. Now, frogs, frog eggs, tadpoles, these are indicators of a clean and healthy environment. Now, when I was at this stage, I also collected firewood for my mother. And I would collect firewood from, from the ground, twigs that have fallen from the trees. But my mother once told me, do not collect firewood from fig trees. There were lots of fig trees around our area. And I asked my mother why. And she said, because the fig trees are trees of God. So we don't burn them, we don't cut them, we let them be for as long as they can stand. And obviously, for that reason, they would usually grow into big, huge trees. Very impressive. Now, this was before we became Christians. When we became Christians, we lost that aspect of our culture. We were taught that God should not be associated with the trees. That's pagan. That's pagan religion. And my people used to believe that God lived on Mount Kenya. Again, that was said to be pagan religion. Now, because they associated God with these huge trees and Mount Kenya, they also protected these resources. They protected these trees. And because they grew to be very huge, they helped hold the soil together. They prevented landslides, especially because these are hills. There are many, these are areas where, these are highlands. And also because they sent their roots deep into the ground. They broke the underground rock, they reached the underground water reservoirs, and they brought the water up along with the roots, and wherever there was a depression and a weakness in the ground, the water was gushed out, and we would say, hey, a spring. And the little river where I was playing with the frogs and tadpoles was such a stream. I could actually go and see where the water was gushing out from the belly of the ground, of the earth. And this water would literally push the grains of the soil. And I would watch, and I would be fascinated by this natural phenomenon. Now that's a very beautiful world for a child. It generates a lot of imagination. It generates a lot of creativity. It gives you a feeling that you belong to this environment, to this land. Now, during the time that I was growing up, and about 20 years later, we became developed, and we assumed a new cultural phenomenon that did not respect trees as trees of God. Trees were perceived as a resource to be extracted, to be used, to be cut, to be converted into cash so that you can buy things. But then, at a certain time, when we introduced cash crops, especially tea in this area, we cut all the trees so that we could put the tree bushes to get rich, so that we could sell these to the outside world. And so indeed, one of the victims was my fig tree. It was cut. And obviously, there must have been a connection between my fig tree and the stream, because once the fig tree was cut, the stream dried up. And everything disappeared. The frogs disappeared, the tadpoles disappeared, the frog eggs disappeared. The next generation, my own children, could not play in the same stream the way I did as a child. Now, if that cultural aspect had not been destroyed, we would have protected that tree and many others. We would have protected Mount Kenya and many other mountains. We would have protected the ecological system because we were very close to it. So sometimes when we move away from what we think is primitive culture and from what we think are primitive values, we become very industrialized. And we go into the towns and cities and we become children of the jungle, concrete jungle, instead of being children of the soil. Then we become completely detached and we no longer know where our water comes from. We don't know where our food comes from. There are children who think that milk comes from the supermarket, or milk comes from cows, which eat grass, which grows when there is rain. And the rain comes when the environment is well protected and the trees are well protected and the mountains are well protected. This connection to me is what we lose when we lose our culture. And how wonderful it would be if we could not lose the traditional wisdom, the traditional experiences that we have accumulated in the course of our history, thousands and thousands of generations. And you know, until very recently, we didn't know how to read and write. And many of our cultures did not have a form of writing. So our experiences, our knowledge, our wisdom is coded in our culture, in our songs, in our stories, in our traditions. And when we are encouraged to lose this, sometimes in the name of God, it's very, very unfortunate, because then to us, instead of the environment being part and parcel of who we are, instead of identifying ourselves with nature and knowing that we are part of that nature, we detach ourselves and we see the natural environment as something to privatize, something to turn into money, to turn into commodities. And so, of course, all of us start to scrabble for it. And those who have the power eventually own it, control it, and may even put others away, exclude others, and sooner or later, those who are excluded will come back and they try to seek justice. And that's when conflict comes in. Which brings me to the point why the Norwegian Nobel Committee decided to give our work recognition. It's because we succeeded in bringing this aspect to our work, making the connection, making the linkage between the need for us to have that wisdom, that knowledge, to know that we are part and parcel of nature, and we need to manage our environment, not as a commodity, but as a very important part and parcel of our own life.
Wow. She basically answered all the questions.
I know.
in one
It's like,
statement.
I'm putting this aside over
I'm
here.
putting this
You
aside.
Go ahead.
We have a few more.
Whatever you want.
Can you quickly, there's two key points before we have 10 minutes, I think, right? How does peace and the environment, why are they linked? And then how does planting a tree solve so many problems?
Well, the tree, I guess, let me say this, that when the Norwegian Nobel Committee gave us the Nobel Peace Prize, and people heard, oh, it is that tree planting lady. And people wondered, what is the connection between tree planting and peace? Well, you need to read the book Unbound, because there you will see the linkage that the Norwegian Nobel Committee recognized. Because the linkage is that we need to accept and understand and appreciate that we live on a planet. And so far, the American astronauts haven't found any other planet that is like ours. This is the only one where life as we know it exists. And so beautiful and so precious, we must protect it. And so the committee said, we need to appreciate that we live on a planet with limited resources. Therefore, these resources must be managed responsibly, accountably. They must be shared more equitably. And we can only do so if we accept to govern ourselves within governance systems that are democratic, that allow for the rule of law to be in charge, that allow respect for human rights, that promote equity and justice. If we manage ourselves that way, we are more likely to preempt the conflicts that we know often comes because of the scrabble for the resources. And indeed, when you think of all the conflicts we have in the world, whether they are local conflicts, such as we have in Kenya between communities who fight over grazing ground and water, or whether they are bigger conflicts where people are fighting over oil, fighting over land, fighting over water, fighting over rivers, it is often a matter of who is going to control these resources and who is going to be allowed to participate in the sharing of these resources and who is going to be excluded. And as I said earlier, those who feel excluded, those who feel marginalized, those who feel victimized, sooner or later seek justice. And sometimes, in seeking that justice, they bring about conflict that may escalate into war. And so it is very, very important for us to understand and to change our mindset about what we think about peace. It is not an abstract thing. As we live, every one of us, every day of our lives, we either conduct ourselves in a way that promotes peace or in a way that invites conflict and eventually wars. This was the message that the Norwegian Nobel Committee was bringing. And this is the work that we have been trying to practice, especially in our part of the region, which, as you know, has been plagued with conflict. And every one of them is due to resources. And that's why quite often I say, Africa is not a poor continent. We wouldn't be fighting if Africa was a poor continent. We are fighting because there are many resources in that region. We are fighting because we are not in agreement as to who should access these resources and who should be excluded. And sometimes those of us who have the power, whether it's the political power, the economic power, the gun power, are the ones who control. And the rest try to seek justice, sometimes by turning themselves into gorillas. Now we condemn them, but when you remove a lot of the superficial paraphernalia, which are the excuses we use, we see that these are people seeking justice. And so it is very, very important for us to allow ourselves to be persuaded to change our mindset, and as a family of human beings, to learn that whether it is us or our future generations, there is a better way of dealing with the conflict, and that we can live in ways that preempt these conflicts. That's the message. It is possible. Nothing is impossible, but it is not easy. And nobody ever said that getting peace is easy. Promoting justice is easy. Promoting human rights is easy. It is not. It has never been. But we can be challenged to embrace a new beginning, a new moral consciousness that embraces this concept of peace.
Wow, that's so terrific. We have a minute, right? A couple
That's
minutes.
true. If you want to ask about the tree.
I would
think
love
we
to
should
hear
ask
about
the
the tree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about why planting a tree is so healing, and talk about Greenbelt in here.
Well, the tree for us in the Greenbelt movement is a symbol, a symbol of hope, a symbol of what people can do for themselves, a symbol of self-empowerment, a symbol of peace. Many people, when they look at our work, if you go to our website, greenbeltmovement.org, you will see that there are very many other activities we are carrying out. But the tree remains our focal point. And we do that because a tree is visible, a tree has multi-purpose. If you plant a tree as a farmer, you know that it will give you firewood, you know it will give you building materials, you know it will give you shade, you know it will clean your air, you know that it will set roots deep into the ground, it will hold your soil, you know it will drop leaves and it will replenish the soil. If it's a fruit tree, you know it's going to give you fruits. And if it is a tree that animals love, it's going to give you fodder. I mean, what a friend we have in a tree. It's a beautiful symbol of what we can do. And recently I learned, I was visiting Japan, and I went to Japan and I learned so much in Japan. And one of the things that I learned was a concept they call mutainai. And it came about because we were talking about how in my country we are trying to get rid of thin plastic, which is thrown into the atmosphere, into the environment. And when these papers go into the environment, they end up on trees, they end up on the ground, they end up in drainages, they end up in the stomachs of animals. So I was trying to explain how we are trying to encourage companies to have a corporate responsibility and not just to pursue profit, but also to have a responsibility towards the environment. So I was urging them not to stop producing plastic, but to produce plastic that we can reuse, that we can recycle, so that we reduce the amount of plastic that is thrown into the environment. So the Japanese told me that even they had a concept in their traditions. Talk of tradition again. In their traditions, they had a concept called motainai. And this concept is a concept that is entrenched in the Buddhist tradition. And it teaches them to not be wasteful about resources, to be grateful about resources, to be appreciative about resources. And in fact, when they would tie gifts, and you know, Japanese have a beautiful way, it's quite an art, tying gifts in Japan. They would tie gifts in these beautiful cloth known as furoshiki. And once they give you the gift, you're supposed to take the gift and you return the cloth so that it will be used again. The concept of reusing and not wasting resources. But the Japanese people are also a very affluent society, a society that consumes very highly. So I learned about that concept, which I think is beautiful, and I just thought of how many trees would be saved if we were using such a cloth rather than paper. And in fact, later on I saw some of those furoshiki which were made from recycled plastic. Yeah. I also learned, I also learned that each one of us needs 10 trees per year to take care of the carbon dioxide we breathe out. Right?
Very good.
Green belt movement, or do you want to just a little bit
About the Green Belt movement. Well, the Green Belt movement is a grassroots environmental organization, mostly driven by women, and its main focus is to plant trees and to promote a holistic approach to development. We plant trees, we plant fruit trees, we protect forests, we protect biological diversity. We also educate so that people, whether it is children, whether it is adults, whether it is legislators, whether it is governments, that we all have a better understanding of the need for us to have a more holistic approach to development. Quite often people say, can we really protect the environment and at the same time develop? Well, we don't have a choice. We need a balance because we need the environment to be able to survive. So the Green Belt movement encourages people to practice a holistic approach to their way of life.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you.